One thing I find really important in trying to pick out patterns and structures in a book is to look for repeated literary indicators of what's going on. And something which I've picked out is this repeated phrase that we get at the start of chapter 3, I think, at the start of Othniel's reign, and which then occurs a number of other times, is this phrase, Israel did evil in the eyes of the Lord. And as I say, it appears once in the first 2 chapters, which are really just overviews of the whole book, and they're in Hebrew, they're in this particular verbal form, which sort of gives them a habitual sense, like whenever this happened, Israel would do evil and the Lord would raise up a judge and he would deliver them, and then they would go back to their old ways and so forth. So there it's introducing it as this repeated thing. And then in the narrative proper, in chapter 3 verse 7 onwards, it becomes this refrain which very much divides up the narrative. And what it does interestingly is it divides up the narrative into enemies rather than into judges. So first, before this guy Kushan Rishathaim invades, we get this phrase, Israel did evil, and that prompts him to come. Then in verse 12, we get the same refrain, and this Moabite Eglon is raised up. And then parallel with that, we get this another refrain, Israel again did evil, and this king of Canaan, Jabin, gets raised up. And you can see there then that Israel did evil is starting this new time horizon, if you like, and then the phrase Israel again did evil in the eyes of the Lord, that is introducing 2 parallel episodes. Then when the word again drops out, in chapter 6 and verse 1, it's again a new horizon, and this is the Midianites come, and this is a nationwide incident. So it's said very explicitly, the Midianites covered the whole land, and Gideon delivers from the Midianites. And the next 2 instances of that statement, Israel again did evil, are, as before, they're parallel, they're simultaneous, concurrent narratives which are going on. And you can see now that each of these incidents, each of these sequences of events below Israel did evil, they can have multiple judges. So Abimelech and Tola and Gideon, in fact, beneath the sort of chapter 6 column. But they all have one and only one enemy, which I've put in gold there. So the Midianites in Gideon's case, and then in chapter 13, Samson goes against the Philistines, and Jephthah goes against the Ammonites, and there are a few other judges scattered around at the same time. So you get this phrase that divides up sort of chapters 3 through to 16 into 6 discrete sections. And for me, that's something that's well worth being aware of. It's noted in very old commentaries, so Kyle and Delitzsch or something, so 19th century commentator, they noticed the repetition of that phrase and didn't build on it a great deal, but they noticed how it cut up the narrative into 6 blocks. And I've then used that to divide the narrative up into this 2x3 grid, which, as I say, it divides up the narrative not by judge, which is commonly what's done, but by the oppressor. And I put this forward as a sort of work in progress. I haven't sort of drawn firm conclusions from it, but I think it's important when we're sort of looking at the text to try and identify a division which is inherent in the text itself, and then to allow that to shape our interpretation of the narrative rather than vice versa. And when you look at this 2x3 grid, you can see a number of interesting things. So in the top row, we've got individual kings who come against Israel. So Cushan, Eglon, and Yavin, these are all individual rulers who come against Israel and make trouble for them. In the bottom of the row, sometimes we get individual kings mentioned, but it's always said that the nation as a whole comes against them. So the Midianites or the Ammonites or the Philistines come. So specific types of oppressor are coming. I don't know if that's showing a worsening of oppression or a mounting of dominion against Israel. It certainly could be that. If you go back to that sort of chronology chart which I had, you'll see that Jephthah and Samson, I've kind of I've put them within the reigns of the Philistines and the Ammonites, precisely because they're never said to subdue their enemies, and they're not said to end the hold of the Ammonites or the Philistines. Sort of Samson's 20 years judgeship is sort of couched within this 40-year reign of the Philistines. So it might be showing sort of growing oppression on the behalf of the enemies. Another interesting thing that you can look at in that grid is not looking at the rows and the commonalities there, but looking at the columns and what is going on there. And you see that Israel's enemies come from quite specific sources. So if you think of Cushan and the Midianites, these are people who come from Abraham's sort of distant kinsmen, I guess. So Cushan is said to arise from this place, Aram Naharaim, which is Abraham's hometown. He sends his servant back there in Genesis 24 to get a bride for Isaac. And Midianites, the Midianites are obviously descended from Keturah. So this is one of Abraham's, I think it refers to her as a concubine. I'm not 100% sure, but it's not Abraham's main wife, if I can use that phrase. Again, it's never portrayed as a good thing, multiple marriage in the Old Testament. And so these enemies arrive from Abraham's sort of fairly distant kinsman. If you then think of the second column, Eglon and Ammon, these so Eglon is a Moabite, Ammonites obviously descend from Ammon. So these are direct descendants of Lot in Genesis 19. So he has through his daughters, in fact, two sons, Moab and Ammon. And so the second column, these are enemies that come specifically from the loins of Lot. And in this third column, Jabin, who is said to be a Canaanite, and the Philistines, they, if you look at Genesis 10's table of nations, they come explicitly from the Egyptian side of things, so from the Hamites. And so you can look at some commonalities which that grid helps you to draw out, and you can sort of probably go a fair bit further. I mean, I won't go into so much detail at this stage, but I mean, if you think again of the right hand column, then in Jabin's case, so the enemy there is slain by the hand of a woman, who is this lady Yael, who in rather gruesome fashion disposes of Sisera with a tent peg through the temple. And in chapter 16, in Samson's fall, there's an interesting contrast in that Samson is sort of undone, as it were, by a woman, by Delilah, and she pins his hair with a needle, which is actually the same word as the word for tent peg in chapters 4 and 5, which Jael is said to use. And so there's a sort of commonality there, but inverted, I guess, that there it's Samson's downfall. And I'm sure that, you know, having that structure in mind will bring other connections to light. And as I say, I haven't got firm thoughts on them, but that's a sort of a work in progress and something that I like because it's given by the text.
Is there anything that this sort of sense of almost things being, the land being overrun towards the end rather than dealt with? I guess that's almost the opening refrain, is that they did not succeed to, and the chapter 1, I guess, is illustrating elements of success. They dealt with, but then there's that moment, the Benjaminites, however, did not drive out the Jebusites, and then that seems to be the beginning of a sort of series of failed conquests, and allowing people to still, which links in with King Saul, I guess, a little bit of his original, or the main sin that is picked up with him. But so do you think even that sort of chronology of, it seems early on they're dealt with almost completely, but towards the end, even the judges, although they are achieving quite big conquests, it's sort of almost uncontrollable now?
Yeah, now that's a very interesting observation, because this phrase that we get in chapter 3 and onwards, the land had rest, or the land had, literally it's sort of the land had quiet, some translations translate it as peace, that comes up initially after, for instance, Othniel and Ehud and Barak and Midian, but then it doesn't come up, unless I'm mistaken, it doesn't come up anymore. It's never again said to happen. So yeah, that would fit in with it very well. Chapter 1, I think your analysis is totally right. There is sort of success in the early part of the chapters, but not in the early part of the chapter, but not later on. But there it's done by geography. So in the south and in Judah and Simeon's territory and Benjamin, there is success, but it gets worse and worse as you go further up north. And possibly the idea is further away from Jerusalem, like further away from God's appointed seat of authority. I'm not entirely sure, but yeah, you've got what is sort of played out geographically, if you like, in chapter 1 gets played out, stretched out over time in chapters 13 and 16. So yeah, that's an interesting observation.